What happens when your closest ally starts acting like your biggest threat? For decades, Canada and the United States stood shoulder to shoulder, trading partners, military allies, and neighbors who shared the world's longest peaceful border. But this week, that friendship hit a breaking point. Prime Minister Mark Carney just made a stunning declaration. Canada can no longer rely on the United States. In a live address that sent shockwaves through financial markets, Carney unveiled a plan to double Canada's non-U.S. exports, a direct response to rising American tariffs and political pressure from President Trump. It's a bold move, and a risky one, because for over half a century, more than 75% of everything Canada sells abroad goes straight to the U.S., so why would Carney suddenly turn away from America? And what does this gamble mean for Canada's future? As we dig into the story behind this dramatic shift, one thing becomes clear. This isn't just about trade, it's about power, identity, and whether Canada can truly stand on its own. For years, Canada's prosperity was built on a simple truth. When America thrived, so did Canada. Factories hummed, trade flowed, and the border barely felt like a divide. But now, that bond, the one forged over generations, is showing deep cracks. It started with tariffs. Steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, the lifeblood of Canada's economy, all hit with crushing import duties from Washington. At first, Carney tried to play it cool, calling it a phase in U.S. politics. But then, President Trump crossed a line that changed everything. In a speech that went viral overnight, Trump mocked Canada, claiming it could become the 51st state. For many Canadians, that wasn't just offensive, it was a wake-up call. Carney, who spent years as one of the most respected financial leaders in the world, finally snapped. In his address, his tone was calm, but his message was unmistakable. The U.S. has fundamentally changed its approach to trade. We have to take care of ourselves, because we can't rely on one foreign partner. Those words marked the end of an era, and the start of something no Canadian leader had dared to say out loud for decades. The world's friendliest border had just turned into a fault line. But what drove Carney to take such a dramatic stand, and why now? The answer lies in the mounting economic storm that was quietly brewing behind the scenes. When the tariffs hit, the shockwaves were immediate. Across Ontario's auto belt, plants slowed production. Steelworkers in Hamilton watched orders disappear overnight. Lumber yards in British Columbia, once booming with exports, started cutting shifts and freezing hiring. For decades, Canadian industry moved in rhythm with America's demand. Now, that rhythm was breaking, and for thousands of families, the silence was terrifying. In his speech, Carney didn't sugarcoat it. He admitted that jobs are under threat and that businesses are holding back investment. Behind those words was something deeper: fear. Investors were pulling out, uncertain if trade with the U.S. was still a safe bet. It wasn't just about economics, it was psychological. Canada, a nation built on stability, was suddenly facing something it hadn't experienced in generations: unpredictability. And the numbers were grim. More than 75% of Canada's exports flowed south of the border. Losing even a fraction of that trade could cripple entire sectors. Carney knew he couldn't wait for Washington to change course, because the U.S. wasn't just shifting policies, it was changing philosophy. America was looking inward, and for the first time in modern history, Canada was being left outside the circle. The question wasn't if Canada would adapt, it was how fast. And that's when Carney made the boldest gamble of his career, one that could redefine Canada's future for decades to come. Mark Carney had built his entire reputation on caution, a measured economist who once led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. But this time, he wasn't playing safe. Standing before the nation, Carney announced a plan that stunned even his closest advisors. Canada would double its non-U.S. exports within the next decade. It wasn't just a trade goal, It was a declaration of independence. For over half a century, Canada's economy had been tied to one dominant partner. Now, Carney was telling the country to break free, to bet on itself. He laid out his vision: deeper trade with India and China, renewed partnerships in Europe, and a massive push to open markets in Africa and Southeast Asia. To the world, it sounded ambitious. To critics, it sounded impossible. Because here's the reality: Canada has always been America's closest ally, not its competitor. The U.S. buys everything from Canadian oil to cars to electricity. Rebuilding those trade routes elsewhere isn't just hard, it's historic. But Carney knew the cost of inaction would be worse. The U.S. has changed, he said. We have to take care of ourselves. Those words weren't just policy. They were a challenge to every Canadian company, investor, and worker to start thinking differently. And as he spoke, one thing became clear. This wasn't just an economic plan. It was a test of national identity, whether Canada could truly stand on its own in a world that suddenly felt more divided than ever. But even as Carney laid out his vision for independence, a storm was already brewing, one that would test just how far Canada was willing to go to protect its future. As Carney outlined his plan to loosen Canada's dependence on the U.S., one thing became obvious: the entire world was watching. For Washington, it was a moment of disbelief. Canada, America's most trusted ally, trading partner, and neighbor, was quietly repositioning itself on the global chessboard. And the move came at a time when U.S. tariffs were already driving cracks through long-standing alliances. The message from Ottawa was clear: if the U.S. was going to play hardball, so could Canada. Carney began reaching out to new players, the global giants waiting just outside America's shadow: India, China, the European Union, even smaller nations in Africa and Southeast Asia. His pitch was simple: Canada is open for business. He called the country an energy superpower, reminding the world that Canada holds the third largest oil reserves and the fourth largest natural gas reserves on the planet. Add to that 34 critical minerals, the very resources the Pentagon relies on for defense. And suddenly, Canada wasn't just America's friendly neighbor. It was a nation with leverage. Carney's message hit differently in Washington, because while Trump's tariffs had been meant to pressure Canada, they were also revealing just how much the U.S. still depended on it. 60% of America's imported crude oil comes from Canada, 85% of its imported electricity. In trying to prove dominance, the U.S. had accidentally reminded everyone, including Canada, who really held the power. And now, that power was being quietly realigned. But with every bold move Carney made abroad, the risks at home began to grow. Because while global alliances can bring opportunity, they also bring something else: consequences. And soon, those consequences would come knocking. Every great gamble comes with a price, and Mark Carney knows it. His plan to untangle Canada from its economic dependence on the United States sounded visionary on stage. But in the real world, it came with consequences that were impossible to ignore. The first signs of strain appeared in factories and small towns, the places where policy becomes personal. Exporters began to worry about losing their biggest customer. Auto workers asked if new trade deals with Asia could really replace the orders they were losing from Detroit. And in the steel towns where entire communities depend on cross-border trade, the fear was almost palpable. Carney tried to stay honest about it. In one of his most candid moments, he told Canadians, "We won't transform our economy easily or in a few months. It will take sacrifices and time." Those words hit home. Because what Carney was asking for wasn't just economic reform. It was a mindset shift. A willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term independence. But not everyone was convinced. Critics accused him of gambling with jobs and national stability. Business leaders warned that moving away from America, a market 10 times Canada's size, could leave the country isolated if new deals didn't materialize fast enough. And yet, Beneath the noise, there was something deeper at play, something patriotic. For many Canadians, this wasn't about profit margins. It was about pride. After years of watching the U.S. dictate trade terms, Canada was finally saying, "We choose our own future." But as bold as that sounded, one question lingered. Could Canada truly afford independence? Or would the cost of freedom prove too high? Because as the pressure mounted and markets reacted, Carney's leadership was about to face its biggest test yet. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. Within days of Carney's announcement, the airwaves lit up. Headlines screamed, "Carney turns his back on America," while pundits argued over whether he was saving Canada or isolating it. Opposition leaders saw an opening. They called his plan reckless, accusing him of pushing Canada into an economic war it couldn't win. Business groups warned that global diversification sounded good on paper, but would take decades to pay off. And voters, already weary from years of inflation and trade uncertainty, started asking a dangerous question. Why now? But Carney didn't back down. In fact, the criticism only made him bolder. He went on national television, addressing Canadians directly. "We can't build a secure future by depending on someone who sees us as their 51st state. We must invest in ourselves, in our industries, our people, our sovereignty." It was a rallying cry that split the nation in two. In the cities, young professionals and entrepreneurs applauded his vision. A future where Canada stood tall on the global stage, no longer living in America's shadow. But across the industrial heartland, the mood was far darker. Workers worried their jobs were being sacrificed for politics. Some even accused Carney of turning his back on the working class. The political temperature spiked. Parliament sessions turned into shouting matches. Polls swung wildly. And south of the border, Washington was watching closely, because what started as a trade dispute was turning into something much bigger. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials were furious. Trump's allies accused Carney of grandstanding and warned that new retaliatory tariffs could be coming. It was no longer just about economics. It was about pride, power, and perception. And for the first time in decades, the once unbreakable friendship between Canada and the United States looked like it was cracking. But as the rhetoric grew louder and the stakes higher, Carney faced a choice that could define not just his leadership, but the direction of the entire nation. Would he hold his ground or bend under the pressure of the world's most powerful neighbor? As weeks turned into months, the tension between Ottawa and Washington refused to cool. Markets shifted, polls tightened, and for a moment, it looked like Carney's bold vision might collapse under its own weight. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating, global investors began to take notice. Canada's promise to expand its trade with India, China, and Europe was no longer just a political talking point. It was becoming a magnet for opportunity. New trade delegations formed. Foreign companies announced investments in renewable energy, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing. The story that once sounded like defiance was starting to look like strategy. For the first time in decades, Canada wasn't just following America's economic rhythm. It was writing its own. Carney, once seen as the calm central banker of the world, had transformed into something else entirely, a leader willing to risk comfort for conviction. But he never pretended it would be easy. In his final address before the 2025 budget release, he stood before Canadians, not as a politician seeking applause, but as a realist asking for trust. "We're building something bigger than a trade plan," he said. "We're building an identity, one that doesn't rely on the permission of others to succeed." Those words echoed across the country, from the oil sands of Alberta to the ports of British Columbia. Some called it inspiring, others called it naive. But no one could deny this. Canada was changing. And whether history remembers Carney as the man who rescued Canada's independence or gambled it away depends on what happens next. Because the battle he's fighting isn't just about exports or tariffs. It's about what kind of country Canada wants to be in a world that's rapidly redefining power, loyalty, and survival. So now, the question isn't whether Canada can stand on its own, it's whether it dares to. And as the global spotlight shifts north, one thing is certain. This story, the story of how one leader dared to redraw the map of North America's future, is only just beginning.